Hello, everyone. We are getting ready to kick off our June interview. This interview will be a professional interview with one of our partners on our virtual practicum grant. Michael Munson from Forge will be joining us shortly. I am just going to invite Michael into. There we go. Hello, Michael. How are you?
Hey, good. How are you? It's good to
I'm
be with you.
well. Thank you so much for joining.
We might be having a little bit of a lag, which I know is common for everybody. So, um, anyway, it's good to see you. Good to be with you.
Same to you. Thank you so much. I know that June is a busy month for you, for your organization, so I really appreciate the time.
Yeah, it's great to be here for Pride Month and for talking about the virtual practicum and a lot of the other things that we're going to chat about today. So,
Yeah,
yeah, happy Pride.
awesome. Happy Pride. Do you want to do just a quick introduction about you and the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Michael Munson. I use he or they pronouns. I'm Forge's co-founder and executive director, which those words don't mean a lot to me, but they do to some people. Forge has been around for 30 years. We are a trans anti-violence organization that mostly works with sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, dating violence, all of those things that are usually funded under Office on Violence Against Women. You can hear my dog who's being helpful. Sorry about that. We provide mostly training and technical assistance to victim service providers. It's probably like between 75 and 90% of our work. And then the other percentage, so 10 to 25%, we work directly with trans survivors and loved ones who've experienced harm. So that's kind of like the nutshell of who Forge is. And I'm totally interconnected with the Forge, so I can't tell you who I am without telling you about who Forge is. One little tidbit that is outside of Forge is I'm on the board of directors for Men Healing, which is an organization that supports men who've experienced sexual harm. And so I just want to put a small plug in for their podcast series. So kind of like Instagram Live, but some really great interviews. And we got to talk a little bit about the practicum in those podcasts. So,
And keep the
yeah.
name of the podcast again, just in case anybody missed it.
Yeah, sure. It's with Men Healing. So I think if you can go onto any podcast platform, and if you just search for Men Healing, all one word, you'll find it. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Can you also say again how long Forge has been in existence? I missed that part.
Yep, 30 years.
30 years.
I
Wow.
know. It's really amazing. So, yeah, June is our anniversary date. So it's 30 years this year.
Congratulations. That's quite
Yeah,
an
it's exciting. Yeah. Um,
in your life's work, right?
yeah, I mean,
Most of your life work.
I'm old, but it's been a substantial part of my life. So yeah.
Wow. So you told us about Forge, you told us about the work that your organization is engaged in. Can you talk about some of the unique needs of trans survivors?
Yeah, sure. Do you want more of the work that Forge does before we
Yes, I
talk
do.
about that?
More.
Okay. I mean,
Yeah.
we can go wherever. So let's do that first, because then we can talk more a little bit about the unique needs that maybe make more sense.
Perfect.
Thanks for kind of reflipping that. So we have a really small organization. So I know Avowie's a lot larger than we are. We've got 5 full-time staff who all are very busy worker bees. And like a lot of nonprofits, we really try to stay mission and values focused, but we also are grant funded. So sometimes what we do is kind of led by some of those deliverables. So let me do a quick rundown of some of those things, and then we can talk about some of the barriers that folks face. So Evawi is a partner of ours on a couple of our grant projects, which is super. One of which is a redesigning a toolkit for providers that will help them better serve trans survivors of multiple crimes. So Evawi is one of like 17 partners that will help add some of that content expertise in those areas. As many people might guess, trans folks have been really affected by hate violence in the last many years. And I'm certainly not going to be partisan, but there's been a cultural wave and a legislative wave. So we have been really fortunate to get some funding around hate violence and the intersection of hate violence and sexual violence and intimate partner violence. So we just closed up a really large scale survey on trans people's experiences and resilience around hate violence. And so that data is going to get coming out pretty soon. Like I mentioned before, we do a little bit of services for trans survivors. So if folks want to check out our transsurvivors.com blog, we try to post weekly. It's been a little bit of a lag, but most of our services for survivors are virtual as well. Most of our stuff is training and technical assistance, which but now other folks know. And if I can I tell you a little bit about some of those pieces?
Absolutely.
Great.
Go for it.
I don't want to do all the talking, but I made notes about some of the training that we're doing. So we were really thrilled to be at the VAUI conference, which was in April. Was it April?
Yep.
Okay. It feels like forever ago, doesn't it? And VAUI is a great conference. So if people have not been, go to the conference next year. It's fantastic. So part of that, I did, I think, a couple of workshops this past year. And one of them was focused on the virtual practicum, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. But Grace Francis and a couple of other VAUI staff and a law enforcement officer who's an out trans advocate, we were all part of this really fantastic workshop on the practicum at the VAUI conference. And I'm really grateful too that Grace Francis and I will be presenting on the virtual practicum. And there's a trans scenario in that practicum, which we're focusing on. So we'll be presenting at the Emergency Nurses Conference, which I think is a first for both Grace and for me, and NCVC's National Training Institute out in Portland later this year. So those are some of the fun things. And then Forge will be at many other conferences this summer. And, I hope people will come and say hi if you see us there. So those are some of the things that we're doing. And then, of course, we're partnered with you all on some projects, and we're partnered with some other folks. And that's all really exciting.
So before we talk about the unique needs of trans survivors, I want to kind of go back to, you talked about services for trans survivors. If a trans survivor is looking for support, best place to go is your website. Where do we send folks?
That's a good question. And it's a question that I don't always know how to answer because we don't do a lot of direct services for trans folks. So yes, come to our website. There are resources available for trans survivors. People can use our contact form and reach out to us directly. Our website is mostly for providers. So we encourage providers to come and check us out. But yeah, I think that our website and our trans survivors page, which is a blog, but it's getting revamped to include more survivors resources, are two good places for folks to go.
Great. I think we're in a similar situation where survivors find us, they reach out to us, but we provide direct services. So as the Survivor Voices coordinator, I interact with most of those survivors, but ultimately I am then sending them,
pushing them out
program.
Yeah.
So sounds like
and I know, like you all, I mean, we all have connections with folks across the country. So it's good that we can all help people get connected in their area or to virtual services. So we're in the same spot.
Yeah. So let's talk about those unique needs of trans survivors.
Let's do that. And that's another hard question, right? Of like, what are the unique needs? Because in a lot of ways, when survivors are survivors, they're survivors. It doesn't matter what adjective goes in front of that or who that person is. And on the other hand, it does matter a lot. So we know that, Black folks who are experiencing police violence is really different than white folks experience police violence. There's some overlap, but there's some really unique differences. So it's kind of the same way with trans survivors. So if someone is trans and experiences sexual violence, we as providers need to recognize this is somebody who experienced sexual violence. And they happen to be trans. So what are some of those trans specific things? So one of the things I always, want to really reinforce to folks is that it's not necessarily unique. There's not necessarily unique needs, because if somebody's coming to you, they're coming to you for the reason of they were assaulted. They have a primary need. but there are some differences. So some of the differences are that trans folks do experience higher rates of victimization across almost every area. It's a numbers game, and I don't really like to play the numbers game because, like, victimization is victimization,
Yep.
and it sucks no matter how high your numbers are overall. But trans folks do experience a lot of high rates of victimization, particularly in some of those intimate crimes, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, hate-motivated crimes. And a lot of times trans folks experience multiple forms of crimes across their lifespan. So if someone is coming to see a provider, it is highly likely that they have a history of prior abuse. And that's true for other populations, of course, but it's just something that I think providers need to be really hyper aware of. And that really links into some of the challenges that a lot of trans folks have with not trusting providers,
Sure.
because there might be a long history of trying to access services and support, and our world is not always very kind to people that others see as different. And trans people are not different, but other people sometimes see that. So when there's been that history, right, of being treated poorly, there's a lot less seeking of health, healthcare, mental health care, victim services. So, that's part of what providers need to kind of work on, is making sure that there's not that re-victimization when somebody enters that provider-oriented space. A couple of other things are that a lot of times trans folks have either no access to victim services or limited access. And we can talk about this in a lot of detail if you want, or little detail, but like, for example, shelters. If somebody needs shelter, a lot of shelters still are women only or men only, or people who experience intimate partner violence may end up saying, hey, we can't put you in a shelter for IPV survivors, but we'll put you in a homeless shelter. That's not an equivalent. That's not safe for folks. We know this, right?
At all.
So, that's one of those barriers. And I think sometimes providers forget, or organizations forget, that we need to provide equal access, comparable access to folks. And trans people have been historically denied access to some of those basic rights as survivors. As I mentioned, there's a lot of times that people have just experienced a lot of mistreatment by the services, the systems, the culture, pick the area, and there's been that mistrust or abuse that's caused by systems. So, it's so important for the people that are providing care, whether it's TA providers like Evawi is, or people that are doing direct services, to not cause additional harm on top of what was already happening to that person.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm glad that the shelter piece up. That's a really important part of it.
Yeah, and it's hard to remember, I think, sometimes that folks are experiencing harm within systems that are supposed to not cause harm.
Yeah.
But it happens. Yeah.
So one of the things that I train advocates on is to see the whole person.
Yeah.
So when you are interacting with a survivor, don't just see the victimhood, see the whole person. So what are some other tips for advocates to tailor their response to help them see that whole person, create that trusting rapport?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is great. That's a great way to start. Of like, let's see people as their wholeness. They're not just coming in as this victim. They're coming in with their whole life experiences. And I think one of the things that we oftentimes start out with training folks is to remind people that they know how to do their job. Right. So like, advocates know how to do their job. Most advocates do their job super, 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 super well. And so if advocates cannot get hung up on some variable, like somebody is trans, I don't want to call it a variable, but like, something that sticks out for that advocate. If they cannot get caught up in that, they'll do their job really well if they keep on taking in that whole person. And the transness might be a huge part of somebody's life, or it might be like a little tiny piece. But that advocate's job is just to do their job as an advocate and respond to the needs of that person in front of them. So exactly what you just said, which is let's value the wholeness of who's there. Um, so that's I mean, that could answer all of the questions, right? Of things. I think a couple of other things though that people can remember or think about is the fact that we live in a world that is not very equitable right now. And that's always been true of different populations not having as much access or equality or rights. And I think it's really important for advocates to recognize that a lot of trans people, especially right now, are living in a world that's not very friendly,
Yep.
or very accepting. And so if folks can acknowledge that and recognize that, it will help people be a little bit more gentle, a little bit more kind, maybe a little bit more compassionate, maybe ask questions that extend beyond why somebody is there, to make sure that somebody has enough food, enough housing, enough, some of the things that may not be why they're seeking services.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one of those things of just like taking a step back and going, oh, what is our culture like? How can we help this person? Maybe in more ways than what they're seeking services for. There's some practical things that advocates can do with trans folks. Really practical. We can introduce ourselves with our name and pronouns. And I'm sure that a lot of people have heard that over and over and over again, but not everybody does that. And that opens the conversation, and you can say, hey, what's your name? What's your pronoun? So that is not going to be something that feels like a roadblock for people, because hearing our names and our pronouns are important to everybody. Like Allison, I would not call you George because that's not your name, right? So we want to make sure that we know who we're talking to and reflect that back to them. I think it's also really important that sometimes advocates are the ones that need to advocate for their organization to change their intake forms or
Mm-hmm.
to change their policies.
Yep.
So, making sure that intake forms have a place for pronouns on them, have a place for name of use that might be different than somebody's legal name. Have, if somebody is working with forensic nurse examiners, having gender neutral body maps, which we can talk a little bit more when we talk about healthcare, but like having some of those forms that are inclusive of all bodies and all identities is super important. Advocates can do a lot of things too, like being informed about other people's jobs, because advocates kind of do that,
Yep.
right? They kind of step in and they help in all of these different places. So I know I've mentioned the virtual practicum a couple times. So the Evaluate Virtual Practicum, and there's a scenario on Jordan, who's a Black trans man, and it's a great little scenario. It's about 15 minutes of film time with some discussion and some stuff afterwards, and it's great for advocates to watch that. There's some mirroring of pronoun introduction and where advocates can help along the way. So it's not just for forensic nurse examiners, but it's great for advocates to watch and see some of those resources, just like there's resources for how advocates can help with law enforcement and other providers. And I think the last thing I want to say about advocates is that, and this is intended to both be a plug, but it's true, which is start by believing, right? We got to start by believing. So, as an advocate, that's probably more important than anything else, is to start by believing and then be present and listen. And then all the rest of the stuff is, I don't want to say it's fluff, but if we got somebody and we're believing them, we're good.
Yeah.
We're good.
So
Yeah.
years and years and years ago, I was doing volunteer training new baby advocates to become advocates. And every advocate in that training is always so nervous,
Right.
so, concerned that they're going to mess up, that they're going to do something wrong. And, after taking question after question of what if I do this? What if I do this? What if I do this?
Mm-hmm.
So I finally raised her hand and said, well, what's the worst thing we can do? And in my mind at the time, what came to me immediately was not quite snarky, but a little sassy. I just said, show up drunk. That's the worst thing you can do is show up drunk. Like,
Right.
you're here because you
Right.
have empathy. You're here because you care.
Yes.
And I loved how you said, just do your job. Just rely
Yeah.
on those core advocacy
Yep.
skills of to connect, seeking to understand, meeting the person where they're
Yep.
at, building rapport.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
all of that comes together.
It does. It does. So yeah, don't show up drunk is a good one. But yes, remember your 40-hour training. Remember all the work that you've done for however many years you've done it. Listen, yeah, I mean, I don't want to say it's simple because advocacy work is really hard, but people that are advocates know how to do their job. So
Absolutely.
do your job.
Yeah.
Listen, believe. Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to remember that though, but the don't show up drunk because that's good and important.
I'm
So
sure it was probably about 8:45 at night and I was feeling a little tired.
yeah, but it's still good, right? Yeah, we don't want to be impaired when we're working with survivors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's switch gears and talk about law enforcement.
Yep. Let's do that. Um, we could talk a lot about law enforcement. I think, we've had a lot of Forge and Evaluate have had a lot of conversations about law enforcement in the work that we've done, both Evaluate for Forge and Forge for Evaluate, about how some marginalized communities have just really tough relationships with law enforcement. And there's this kind of cycle of like, well, how do we make a difference and reduce crime and reduce violence if law enforcement are not involved? And how do we encourage trans folks to be able to trust law enforcement when there hasn't always been good, positive, trained law enforcement officers? So that's kind of the preface of, trans people, I think, are oftentimes very hesitant to reach out to law enforcement because of that historical trauma. So like we're in the month of June, which is Stonewall, and the big riot that had cop involvement, and the cops were not doing a good job then. But that was also in the 60s. So we've made progress since then. Some communities have made more progress than others, but a lot of trans people hold Stonewall in their hearts and in their minds and know that that's there. So there can be some challenge with just trans folks coming forward, wanting to report, wanting to have any communication with law enforcement. Some of the good things, though, are that law enforcement can be better trained, and many of them are getting better trained to not be jerks, to be trans affirming, and excuse my language of not being jerks, but like all providers should not be jerks. But sometimes it takes some practice to do that. So there's a couple of places that we always like to refer folks to. One of them is something fairly new that Evaluate created with Sergeant Michael Crumrine, and it's the Emily scenario. And so like the virtual practicum, this is actually a little bit longer, and it's got these little segments. You can probably say more about it than I can, but do you want to say more about it?
Sure. So the scenario that you're talking about is part of our comprehensive victim interviewing training program. It's a course that we offer virtually. The next session is coming up in November. But when we created the program, we created 4 interview role plays. Role play isn't really the right one, but mock interviews, I'll say, where we had a scenario with a survivor, a detective, and an advocate. And so each of these scenarios is intended to show how a victim interview should look, what it should look like, what it could look like. So the scenario that you're referring to is with a trans survivor. There are 3 other survivors, and each of those 3 survivors had very, very negative experiences with law enforcement. 2 of them were arrested for filing a false police report. So it's a great training, all of it combined, the whole interview course, but those mock interviews in particular are extremely powerful.
Yeah, thank you for the description. I forgot that there were other ones in that series. And I think some of the most powerful part is not just like watching kind of the mock interview, but also watching the discussion, like the kind of the let's talk about what we just did and how it felt and what we might do different, and some of that, even though what was captured was really great. So, and is that a free resource that's available to everybody, or is that a behind the paywall?
They have to go through the victim interview course. and we switch up which scenario we use. And I cannot remember which one we're using for November.
Okay.
But you talked about the debrief. I got to serve as the advocate for one of the scenarios. And, as an advocate, it was, really incredible to be a part of, because the survivor in the scenario that I was a part of found it so healing to
Yeah.
participate in this process and see
Yes.
what it could have been. Um, and I remember before just feeling really nervous and unsure of what this would look
Yeah.
like, Emma would feel, but I found it to be instrumental in part of her healing. So
That's fantastic. That's really fantastic. Yeah. Okay. So that may not be a
Grace
resource.
commented, I'm interrupting you and
Yeah.
I apologize, but Grace commented, the Emily interview is open to everyone. So Grace, will you
Excellent.
another comment and tell everyone where they can access it? Because
Great.
I did not know. So Grace
Excellent.
will leave another comment. Let me know.
Perfect. And I thought it was open, but I wasn't sure. So good, good. Thank you, Grace. This is good to know. So yes, people can watch it, and it's fantastic. So the virtual practicum is free for folks and easy to access. That set of interviews with the debrief is available. Okay, so we're going to scope back a little bit if we can. So law enforcement, I really believe, and I think a lot of us believe that do this work, that law enforcement want to do a good job. And sometimes they forget, how to do their good job. One of the cool things that I think about the law enforcement officers who are informed and are doing a good job, they can really make a difference because they're oftentimes the first ones on the scene, the first ones to the hospital, the first ones, that get to where the victim or the survivor is. And because of that power imbalance in our society, law enforcement has a lot of power to influence other people's behavior. So I always look at law enforcement who are with it and who are doing a good job as being able to bring that to the other first responders, to bring that to the hospital setting, to bring that to the advocates. So I think that that's a really great role that law enforcement who are aware of trans people's unique experiences, aware of how to be respectful, can really help kind of move that along so that trans person's going to have a better experience throughout the process if they do access law enforcement. And again, I want to kind of reinforce too that with law enforcement, just like with advocates, they can start by believing. So, realizing that if somebody, if law enforcement gets called and it's a victim, let's believe that survivor. We can figure out the rest of it later, but let's start by believing and going from there. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Couple minutes left, and I want to be respectful of your time because I know you have a busy month, but let's talk about healthcare providers.
You bet. So that's much more my jam than advocates or law enforcement. So Forge has done a lot of stuff with forensic nurse examiners, and we're always really excited to work with them. There's a lot of other, obviously, healthcare providers that can be in the mix with survivors. And just like law enforcement, I think that healthcare providers in general are relatively uninformed about trauma and uninformed about trans folks. So when a trans survivor is seeking primary care, healthcare, or specialty healthcare, or post-assault healthcare, a lot of those providers are just not in the know. And again, that goes back to our job as an organization, your job as an organization, to do that training and to have it be available for folks. So obviously, if we can train folks on how to be more informed about trauma, more informed about the nuances of trans folks, of trans bodies, of some of the unique languages that people may use to talk about their bodies, the better care that person is going to receive. I think there's a couple of things, again, the virtual practicum, which I really love, and the Jordan scenario is a great way to look at and have some kind of an example of how that dynamic could play out with a trans survivor who is seeking some care after sexual assault. There's also a couple of other things that are coming up for forensic nurse examiners that I think is worth mentioning. International Association of Forensic Nurses is creating 15 different scenarios, and 2 of them are about trans clients. So we're really excited about that. We were down in Mobile, Alabama, and I teased that we should have protective service because it was Mobile, Alabama, and not a very trans-friendly place. But so those will be coming out before the end of September, most likely. One is with a trans woman who has a vaginal exam. She's post-op. So that'll be an interesting video. The exam part will not be public. It'll be behind some things, but the rest of the dialogue will be public. And then the second one is about doing a self-collection with a non-binary person. So evidence collection that is a little bit less invasive. Other resource that's coming out is we wrote a really fun but long guide for forensic nurses and medical advocates with NSVRC, so the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, Respect Together, and we're hoping that that's going to come out before the end of their grant year, which is September 30th as well. So those are a couple of places that people can get more resources.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing everything and all the work that you're doing, and the guidance that you provide. Evawi is just so important.
We love working with you all. So, we love doing this Instagram live, which is fun and awkward for us, but we're really, really happy to be here. And I do have time if there are any, if you want to do anything else or want to explore any other territory.
I feel like I had a question about 2 minutes ago and it left my brain.
I hear you. It's the beginning of the week.
Question, you can drop it in the comments. I know that Michael said he's interested in answering any questions that anybody might have. So give folks just a minute to do that. Folks can find you on Instagram. They can find you on your website. Are you on any other platforms?
We are still on Facebook because we are still on Facebook. It works for some populations. And this year we started on TikTok, which is really, really exciting. So we hired somebody new to do our content development, and she is just fabulous and fun. And so I encourage folks to check us out on TikTok. I don't remember what the handle is, but if you look for Forge, you'll find us. I can never remember what all the different handles are for things. I can pop it in the comments after we're off the live too.
That would be great. That would be awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, cool.
I don't
Thank you.
So thank you to Grace for dropping in the note about the interview and where folks can find it.
Yeah. Thank you, Grace. Good to talk with you, Allison. It was really fun.
As well. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.